The dawn of May 29, 1453, broke over Constantinople with an eerie silence. For 53 days, the greatest city in Christendom had endured a relentless siege, its ancient walls shuddering under the impact of massive bronze cannons that announced a new age of warfare. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI knelt in prayer at the Hagia Sophia, knowing that this day would decide not merely the fate of his empire, but the destiny of two worlds. Outside the walls, Sultan Mehmed II, barely 21 years old, prepared to claim the prize that had eluded Muslim conquerors for 8 centuries. What happened in the hours that followed would send shockwaves across 3 continents, transform the balance of global power, and mark the moment when the medieval world gave way to the modern age. The city that stood besieged that spring morning was no ordinary prize. Constantinople had been the jewel of the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years, the bridge between Europe and Asia, the repository of classical knowledge that had been lost to the Latin West. Its massive walls, built by Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, had repelled 23 sieges. The Persians had failed to breach them. The Arabs had hurled themselves against those ramparts repeatedly and been turned back. The city had survived earthquakes, plagues, and civil wars, even the Fourth Crusade's betrayal in 1204, when Western Christians sacked the city and established a Latin kingdom, had only been a temporary interruption. The Byzantine Empire had reclaimed its capital in 1261, and though diminished, Constantinople remained a symbol of continuity with the ancient Roman world. But by 1453, that continuity was hanging by a thread. The Byzantine Empire, which had once stretched from Spain to Syria, had contracted to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories in Greece. The emperor ruled over perhaps 50,000 souls within the city walls, down from a peak population of 500,000 in its glory days. The empire's treasury was empty, its military reduced to a few thousand professional soldiers supplemented by citizen militias. The great aristocratic families that had once filled the Senate chambers and military commands had either fled to Italy or made their accommodations with Turkish power. The Ottoman Empire that now surrounded Constantinople represented everything the Byzantines were not: young, dynamic, expanding, and flush with the confidence of a rising power. Mehmed II had inherited the throne in 1451 at age 19, and he burned with an ambition that his predecessors had only dreamed of. His great-great-grandfather, Bayezid I, had besieged Constantinople in 1397, but had been forced to withdraw. His grandfather, Murad II, had considered the conquest, but concluded the price would be too high. Mehmed had no such hesitation. From the moment he secured his throne, he began preparing for the assault that would make him the master of 2 continents and 3 seas. The young sultan understood that Constantinople could not be taken by conventional means. The Theodosian Walls consisted of 3 defensive lines, an outer wall 60 feet high and 15 feet thick, backed by an inner wall 40 feet high and 12 feet thick, with a moat 60 feet wide protecting the entire system. 25 major towers and numerous smaller fortifications provided overlapping fields of fire. The Golden Horn, the natural harbor on the northern side of the city, was protected by a massive chain boom that prevented enemy ships from entering. The Sea of Marmara protected the southern approach with strong currents and walls that dropped directly into the water. Only the western land walls offered a viable avenue of attack, and those had never been successfully breached. Mehmed's solution to this problem would revolutionize warfare. In the winter of 1452, he commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to construct the largest cannon the world had ever seen. Urban had first offered his services to Constantine, but the emperor's empty treasury could not meet his price. Mehmed could, and he gave Urban unlimited resources to create a weapon that would shatter the medieval world's most formidable fortifications. The result was a monster, 27 feet long, with a barrel diameter of 30 inches, capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. It required 60 oxen to transport and a crew of 200 men to operate. When test-fired outside Adrianople, the sound could be heard 10 miles away, and the projectile buried itself 6 feet into the earth. This was merely the largest of Mehmed's artillery park. He assembled approximately 70 cannons of various sizes, representing an investment in gunpowder technology that dwarfed anything attempted by previous besiegers. The Ottomans had been early adopters of firearms, using hand cannons and small artillery pieces since the late 14th century, but Mehmed's siege train represented a quantum leap in scale and sophistication. He understood intuitively what Western Europeans would not fully grasp for another generation, that gunpowder had fundamentally altered the calculus of siege warfare. Walls that had protected cities for 1,000 years could now be reduced to rubble in weeks. While Urban cast his great bombards in the foundries of Adrianople, Mehmed attended to the diplomatic and logistical preparations for his campaign. He signed a treaty with Venice, ensuring that the powerful maritime republic would remain neutral despite its extensive trading interests in Constantinople. He secured his northern frontier with truces and tributary arrangements with Serbia and Wallachia. He assembled an army that contemporary sources estimated at between 80,000 and 160,000 men, though modern historians generally accept a figure closer to 80,000 combatants plus support personnel. This force included the Sultan's elite janissary infantry, recruited through the Devshirme system from Christian families and trained from childhood to be the most disciplined soldiers in the world. It included Sipahi cavalry, drawn from the Turkish nobility and rewarded with land grants in exchange for military service. It included irregulars and volunteers drawn by the promise of plunder from the wealthiest city in the Mediterranean. The preparation that most alarmed the Byzantines came in the summer of 1452, when Mehmed constructed a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an earlier Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. This new stronghold, called Rumeli Hisari, rose with astonishing speed, its 3 main towers completed in just 4 months. Its purpose was unmistakable: to control all shipping through the Bosphorus and cut Constantinople off from the Black Sea colonies that provided much of its grain supply. When a Venetian ship attempted to run past the fortress without paying tribute, Mehmed's cannons sank it, and the Sultan had the surviving crew beheaded, their captain impaled as a warning. The message was clear. The siege had already begun, even before the first soldier appeared before the walls. Emperor Constantine XI understood the magnitude of the threat he faced. At age 48, he had ruled for only 4 years, and had spent much of that time desperately seeking aid from Western Christendom. The price for that aid was steep: reunion with the Roman Catholic Church, healing the schism that had divided Eastern and Western Christianity since 1054. The theological differences were profound, centered on questions of papal authority and subtle but crucial differences in Trinitarian doctrine. More importantly, centuries of resentment divided the two communions. Many Byzantines had never forgiven the West for the Fourth Crusade's sack of their city. The Orthodox clergy and population viewed Roman Catholicism with suspicion bordering on hostility. When Constantine agreed to the union of churches at the Council of Florence in 1439, he provoked fierce opposition within his own capital. The Orthodox Grand Duke, Lucas Notaras, supposedly declared that he would rather see the Turkish turban in Constantinople than the Latin mitre. But Constantine had few choices. His appeals to the West yielded meager results. Pope Nicholas V proclaimed a crusade, but no crusade materialized. Venice, Genoa, and other Italian maritime powers promised aid but sent only token forces. The bitter reality was that Western Europe was consumed by its own conflicts. The 100 Years' War between England and France had only recently concluded. The Italian states were locked in their perpetual rivalries, and the Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of competing principalities with no central authority capable of mounting a major expedition. The West would send expressions of concern and a handful of volunteers. Nothing more. The volunteers who did come would prove crucial to Constantinople's defense. In late 1452, a Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani arrived with 700 professional soldiers. Giustiniani was an experienced military engineer and commander who had defended Genoese colonies against Ottoman attacks. Constantine immediately recognized his value and appointed him commander of the land walls, giving him authority over both Byzantine and foreign troops defending the critical western sector. Other volunteers trickled in, a few hundred Spanish and Italian soldiers, some Cretan archers, a papal contingent of 200 soldiers under Cardinal Isidore. The Genoese and Venetian communities already resident in Constantinople contributed their own contingents. In total, Constantine could muster perhaps 7,000 fighting men, including his own Byzantine troops and armed civilians, to defend 14 miles of walls against an Ottoman army more than 10 times larger. The demographic composition of Constantinople's defenders revealed the cosmopolitan nature of the Byzantine capital's final hours. Greeks formed the majority naturally, but they fought alongside Italians, Catalans, Germans, and even a few Turks who had fled Ottoman service. The Venetian bailiff Girolamo Minato commanded the Venetian contingent, while his Genoese counterpart was the podesta Giovanni Lomellino. These Italian colonies maintained their own quarters in the city and operated with considerable autonomy, but the approaching storm forced them to cooperate with Byzantine authorities and with each other, despite the intense commercial rivalry between Venice and Genoa that had repeatedly erupted into warfare. As winter turned to spring in 1453, Ottoman forces began gathering around Constantinople. The Sultan arrived on April 5th and immediately established his headquarters opposite the most vulnerable section of wall, near the Lycus River Valley, where the fortifications dipped to accommodate the ancient riverbed. He positioned his best troops, the janissaries at this point, reserving them for the critical assault. His elite Sipahi cavalry covered the flanks and patrolled to prevent any relief force from approaching. The irregular troops, the Bashi bazouks, filled out the siege lines and would serve as the first wave in assaults, exhausting the defenders before the professional soldiers attacked. The great bombards began their work immediately. Urban's massive cannon required 3 hours to load, could only fire 7 times per day, and eventually cracked from the stress of its own discharges. But while it operated, it was devastating. Each shot created a crater in the Theodosian Walls, and though Byzantine engineers worked frantically to repair the damage each night, the cumulative effect was inexorably destructive. The smaller cannons maintained a constant bombardment, their projectiles chipping away at masonry that had stood for 1,000 years. The psychological impact was perhaps as significant as the physical damage. The defenders had never experienced anything like the constant thunder of artillery. The ground shook with each discharge. Buildings throughout the city sustained damage from the vibrations. Sleep became impossible near the walls, but Constantine's engineers adapted quickly. They hung bundles of wool and leather hides on the walls to absorb the impact of stone cannonballs. They constructed wooden palisades behind damaged sections to create backup defensive lines. Most effectively, they dug deep trenches at night and filled them with earth and timber, creating cushions that absorbed cannonballs that missed the walls. The Byzantine capacity for improvisation, honed through centuries of defending against numerically superior enemies, was on full display. Every morning revealed new damage, and every night saw repair crews working by torchlight to restore the defenses. The naval dimension of the siege opened with a demonstration of Byzantine resourcefulness that briefly kindled hope among the defenders. Mehmed had assembled a fleet of perhaps 120 ships, mostly smaller galleys and transports, to blockade the sea approaches to Constantinople. However, the massive chain boom across the Golden Horn prevented his ships from attacking the vulnerable northern walls. On April 20th, 3 Genoese galleys sent by the Pope, along with a large Byzantine transport ship carrying grain from Sicily, approached Constantinople from the south. Mehmed ordered his fleet to intercept them. What followed was a naval battle in full view of both armies and the entire population of Constantinople. Thousands of spectators watching from the walls and shores. The Christian ships, larger and higher than the Ottoman galleys, had the advantage of favorable winds. As the Ottoman fleet swarmed around them, the Genoese and Byzantine crews fought from their elevated decks, pouring arrows, crossbow bolts, and Greek fire onto their attackers. The Ottomans attempted to board, but were repelled repeatedly. Mehmed himself rode his horse into the sea, shouting encouragement to his sailors, so enraged by their failure that he had to be restrained from riding further into the water. For hours the battle continued, the Christian ships fighting off attack after attack while struggling to make headway against adverse currents. Finally, a wind shift allowed them to break through and reach the Golden Horn boom, which was lowered to admit them before being raised again. The defenders erupted in celebration. The Ottomans had suffered a humiliating defeat, and more importantly, Constantinople had received desperately needed supplies. Mehmed's response to this embarrassment was characteristically audacious. If he could not force the boom, he would bypass it entirely. Over the course of a single night, April 21st to 22nd, Ottoman engineers constructed a wooden roadway that ran over the hills of Pera, behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and down to the Golden Horn. They greased the logs with animal fat and used teams of oxen and hundreds of men to haul approximately 70 ships over this portage, a distance of more than a mile. The Byzantines and Genoese awoke to find an Ottoman fleet inside the Golden Horn, threatening the less defended northern walls and forcing Constantine to disperse his already inadequate garrison to cover more territory. This engineering feat exemplified the Ottoman approach to siege warfare under Mehmed. When conventional methods failed, improvisation and massive application of manpower could achieve what seemed impossible. The young sultan demonstrated a flexibility and creativity that his older, more experienced opponents struggled to match. He was willing to take risks, to attempt solutions that more cautious commanders would dismiss as impractical. The portage of the fleet was dangerous. A determined attack by the Christian naval forces in the Golden Horn during the operation could have turned it into a disaster. But the Genoese in Galata, desperate to maintain neutrality and protect their commercial interests, refused to attack, and the Byzantine ships were too few to act alone. As April gave way to May, the siege settled into a grim routine. The bombardment continued daily, reducing sections of the Theodosian Walls to rubble. Ottoman miners dug tunnels toward the walls, attempting to undermine them, while Byzantine counterminers, led by a German engineer named Johannes Grant, dug their own tunnels to intercept the attackers. Underground battles took place in darkness and confined spaces, struggles to the death in tunnels that often collapsed on both sides. Ottoman forces made periodic assaults, testing the defenses, seeking weak points, keeping the defenders in a constant state of exhaustion. Constantine and his advisors debated their strategy endlessly. Should they concentrate their forces at the most threatened points, or maintain a thin line across all the walls? Should they attempt a sortie to destroy the Ottoman artillery? Should they send ships to run the blockade and seek reinforcements? Every option carried enormous risk. The emperor spent his nights making rounds of the walls, encouraging his soldiers, personally checking the repairs, sharing in the hardships of the common defenders. Chronicles describe him as constantly moving, rarely sleeping, driving himself and his men through sheer force of will. Inside the city, the population oscillated between hope and despair. Processions of religious relics wound through the streets, the Virgin's icon carried from church to church in supplication for divine intervention. Prophecies circulated, ancient texts that supposedly predicted Constantinople would never fall, or that angels would descend to save the city at its darkest hour. The practical-minded hoarded food and valuables, prepared to flee if the walls were breached. Tensions between Orthodox and Catholic, between Greeks and Latins, simmered beneath the surface despite the common danger. When the formal ceremony of church union was celebrated in the Hagia Sophia in December 1452, many Orthodox faithful refused to attend, and some priests declared they would not enter a church polluted by Latin heresy. Mehmed, meanwhile, faced his own pressures. The siege was expensive, draining his treasury and tying down his army. His advisors, particularly the older, more conservative Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, urged caution, even suggesting negotiations. There were troubling reports from Anatolia of unrest that might require the Sultan's attention. A long siege risked intervention by Western powers. Already there were rumors of Venetian and Hungarian forces preparing to relieve Constantinople. The Sultan's youth and relative inexperience made him vulnerable to palace intrigues. A failure here could cost him his throne. But Mehmed was sustained by an absolute conviction that Constantinople was his destiny. He had studied the city's defenses obsessively, consulted with the best military engineers available, prepared more thoroughly than any previous besieger. He had staked his reputation and his throne on this conquest. There would be no retreat. In early May, he sent Constantine a final offer, surrender the city, and the emperor and his people would be allowed to leave in peace. Constantine's response was dignified and defiant. He could not surrender the city that had been entrusted to his care. If Mehmed wanted Constantinople, he would have to take it by force. The decision to launch the final assault came on May 25th. Mehmed convened his war council and announced that a general assault would take place on May 29th. His commanders had 4 days to prepare their troops and ensure every unit understood its objective. The attack would be simultaneous across the entire western wall, with the main effort concentrated at the Lycus Valley, where the bombardment had created the most damage. The strategy was straightforward: overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers, exhaust them with wave after wave of attacks, and finally break through when their strength failed. Inside Constantinople, the defenders could sense the approaching climax. The bombardment intensified. Ottoman troops moved closer to the walls, positioning themselves for the assault. Constantine addressed his soldiers, both Byzantine and foreign, in the churches and on the walls. Contemporary accounts, while perhaps embellished, capture the essence of his message. They were defending not just a city but civilization itself, the legacy of Rome, the treasures of Christianity. If they must fall, they would fall with honor, remembered by history for standing against impossible odds. The night of May 28th was one of strange calm. The Ottoman bombardment ceased. The besiegers prepared themselves with prayers and ritual purifications. The besieged did the same, filling the churches for what many believed would be their final religious services. Constantine made a last tour of the walls, thanking his commanders and soldiers. According to tradition, he then returned to the palace, asked forgiveness from his household for any offenses, and went to the Hagia Sophia for a final time. It was there, in the great cathedral that had stood for 900 years as the architectural wonder of the Christian world, that he prepared his soul for what dawn would bring. The Ottoman assault began approximately 1:30 in the morning on May 29th. The first wave consisted of the Bashi bazooks. Irregular troops promised the first opportunity for plunder. They attacked with ladders and grappling hooks, attempting to scale the outer walls while Ottoman artillery resumed its bombardment. The defenders, exhausted from nearly 2 months of siege, but sustained by desperate courage, repelled this first attack. The irregulars, lacking the discipline of professional soldiers, fell back in disorder after suffering heavy casualties. The second wave followed immediately. The Anatolian provincial troops, better trained and equipped than the irregulars. They pressed the attack more systematically, concentrating on sections where the walls had been damaged. For 2 hours they struggled to establish a foothold on the ramparts, and for 2 hours the defenders held them back. Giustiniani was everywhere along the walls, directing the defense, rallying his troops, personally fighting at the most critical points. Byzantine fire weapons, the legendary Greek fire that had saved Constantinople from earlier sieges, took a terrible toll on the densely packed attackers. Around dawn, Mehmed committed his best troops, the janissaries. These elite soldiers advanced in disciplined ranks, their drums beating a steady rhythm, their officers keeping them in formation despite the hail of arrows and projectiles from the walls. They focused their attack on the Lycus Valley sector, where the walls had sustained the most damage and where a Genoese fortification called the Porta, a small gate in the inner wall, provided a potential breach point. The critical moment came when Giustiniani was struck by a projectile, probably a bullet from an early firearm. The wound was serious enough that he asked to be evacuated from the wall. Constantine himself begged the Genoese commander to remain, understanding that his departure would demoralize the defenders. But Giustiniani insisted. His men carried him toward the harbor and a ship that might take him to safety. He would die of his wounds weeks later on the island of Chios. But his departure at this crucial moment arguably decided the battle. The troops defending the Lycus sector, seeing their commander carried away wounded, began to waver. What happened next remains disputed, lost in the confusion and contradictory accounts of battle. According to some sources, a group of Ottoman soldiers discovered the Porta gate had been left unlocked, possibly by defenders who had passed through it during a sortie, and failed to secure it properly in their haste to return to the walls. According to other accounts, the janissaries simply overwhelmed the defenders at the breach created by weeks of bombardment. Most likely, the truth combines both explanations. The defenders, exhausted and demoralized by Justiniani's departure, were unable to prevent the janissaries from exploiting the gate and damaged walls simultaneously. Once Ottoman troops established themselves inside the inner wall, the defense collapsed rapidly. Defenders attempting to retreat from the outer wall found themselves trapped between two enemy forces. Panic spread. The chain reaction that doomed Constantinople was not a single catastrophic failure, but a cascade of small defeats that accumulated into disaster. Each section of wall that fell forced adjacent defenders to fall back or be surrounded. Each retreat opened new vulnerabilities. Within hours, Ottoman troops were flooding into the city through multiple breach points. Constantine, realizing the city was lost, made his final choice. According to the most reliable accounts, he stripped away the imperial regalia that marked him as emperor and plunged into the fighting as an ordinary soldier, seeking death in battle rather than capture. The exact circumstances of his death remain unknown. Some sources claim he fell near the gate of St. Romanus. Others place his death at different locations. His body was never definitively identified, though a headless corpse wearing purple boots, the footwear of emperors, was later found and presumed to be his. The last Roman emperor died as he had lived, defending his city to the final breath, joining the ranks of his soldiers in a gesture that embodied the tragic nobility of Byzantium's end. The fall of Constantinople unleashed horrors upon the civilian population. Under the customs of siege warfare, a city that refused surrender could be sacked, and Mehmed had promised his troops 3 days of plunder. Ottoman soldiers poured through the streets, seeking valuables, killing those who resisted, and enslaving thousands. The Hagia Sophia became a scene of desperation as civilians sought sanctuary within its walls, believing ancient prophecies that angels would save the city before the Turks reached the great cathedral. Instead, Ottoman soldiers broke down the doors and began selecting captives for the slave markets. Priests conducting services were cut down at the altars. Icons and religious treasures that had survived for centuries were destroyed or looted. The slaughter and plunder were extensive, but not absolute. Mehmed entered the city in the afternoon of May 29th and immediately ordered his troops to end the sacking, a day earlier than promised. Some accounts suggest he was moved by the destruction and sought to preserve the city he had conquered. Others attribute his decision to pragmatic concerns. He wanted Constantinople intact as his new capital, not reduced to a depopulated ruin. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia, where he stopped the looting and ordered the building converted to a mosque. A imam was summoned to give the call to prayer from the cathedral that had been Christianity's greatest church, marking the symbolic transformation of the city from Christian to Muslim. The final casualty figures remain unknown and hotly debated. Byzantine sources, written by survivors and refugees, tend to emphasize the slaughter and report that much of the population was killed. Ottoman sources downplay the violence and emphasize Mehmed's merciful treatment of the conquered. Modern historians estimate that perhaps 4,000 defenders and civilians died during the final assault and immediate aftermath, while 30,000 to 50,000 were enslaved. Many of the Italian merchants and soldiers managed to escape on their ships before the final collapse. The emperor's family and leading Byzantine nobles were killed or enslaved. The Byzantine aristocracy, which had governed an empire for over 1,000 years, essentially ceased to exist as a coherent class. Mehmed moved quickly to establish his authority over his new capital. He declared himself Caesar of Rome, claiming to be the rightful successor to the Roman emperors. He began a massive reconstruction and repopulation effort, forcibly relocating populations from Anatolia and the Balkans to restore Constantinople's population. He granted religious freedom to the remaining Christians and Jews, appointing a new Orthodox patriarch and confirming the church's right to manage its own affairs under Ottoman rule. This pragmatic tolerance served multiple purposes. It prevented a total exodus of skilled professionals and merchants. It demonstrated his magnanimity as a conqueror, and it created a framework for governing his multi-religious empire. The shock of Constantinople's fall reverberated across Europe. News of the disaster reached Venice on June 29th and spread rapidly throughout Italy and beyond. Pope Nicholas V called for a new crusade to reclaim the city, but the response was negligible. The Italian states were too divided, the French and English too exhausted from their long war, the German princes too fragmented to mount an effective expedition. The promised crusade never materialized. The bitter truth was that while all of Christian Europe lamented Constantinople's fall, none were willing to pay the price to reverse it. The refugees who fled Constantinople carried with them the treasures that would help spark the Renaissance. Byzantine scholars who had preserved and studied ancient Greek texts for centuries now brought those manuscripts to Italy, where hungry scholars in Venice, Florence, and Rome received them eagerly. The revival of classical learning that we call the Renaissance was already underway in Italy, but the influx of Byzantine scholars and texts accelerated the process dramatically. Cardinals and princes competed to hire refugee scholars. Libraries and universities absorbed the manuscripts. The classical heritage that Byzantium had preserved through the Dark Ages now enriched Western Europe at the very moment when Constantinople itself ceased to be a Christian city. The geopolitical consequences were equally profound. The Ottoman Empire now controlled both shores of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, commanding the strategic waterways between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Italian maritime republics lost their favorable trading privileges and found themselves dealing with a single powerful empire rather than a weak Byzantine state they could manipulate. Trade routes to the east became more difficult and expensive, as Ottoman customs duties and occasional hostilities disrupted the flow of Asian goods to European markets. This economic disruption contributed to Western Europe's search for alternative routes to Asia, ultimately driving the age of exploration that would see Portuguese, Spanish, and other European navigators seeking sea routes around Africa, and eventually stumbling upon the Americas. Militarily, the fall of Constantinople demonstrated the decisive importance of artillery in siege warfare. The medieval castle and fortified city, seemingly impregnable behind stone walls, was suddenly vulnerable to gunpowder weapons. This realization drove a revolution in military architecture across Europe. The vertical walls of medieval fortifications gave way to the low, thick, angular walls of the Trace Italian, designed to resist artillery bombardment and provide platforms for defensive cannons. The social and political consequences were significant. Smaller nobles in their castle strongholds could no longer defy royal authority when the king commanded artillery that could reduce those castles to rubble. The consolidation of power in the hands of monarchs who could afford expensive gunpowder weapons and professional armies accelerated the transition from feudalism to centralized nation-states. The psychological impact on Christian Europe was perhaps the most significant immediate consequence. Constantinople had stood for over 1,100 years as the eastern bastion of Christendom. Its fall shattered assumptions about Christian invincibility and divine favor. The Ottoman Empire was not some distant threat, but a powerful state on Europe's doorstep, ruling territories in the Balkans and threatening further expansion. The fear of the Turks would haunt European consciousness for centuries, driving crusading rhetoric, shaping diplomatic alliances, and creating a cultural divide between Christian Europe and the Ottoman world that persisted long after the empire's eventual decline. For the Ottoman Empire, the conquest marked its transformation from a regional power to a world empire. Mehmed II, who would be known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror, had legitimized his dynasty and established Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, though the old name persisted in common use, as one of the great imperial capitals. His successors would expand Ottoman power to its zenith, conquering the Arab lands to the south, pushing deep into Europe, besieging Vienna itself. The Ottoman Empire would remain the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean for 4 centuries, a fact that reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape of 3 continents. The Orthodox Christian world lost its traditional center, but not its faith. The Patriarch of Constantinople continued under Ottoman rule, and Orthodox Christianity survived and even flourished in many regions under Turkish sovereignty. But the role of protector of orthodoxy gradually shifted northward to Russia, where the Grand Prince of Moscow began styling himself as the heir to Byzantine imperial authority. The concept of Moscow as the Third Rome, the successor to Constantinople and ancient Rome, would profoundly influence Russian political ideology and foreign policy for centuries. The date May 29, 1453, represents one of those rare moments when historical epochs genuinely change. Medieval Christendom's dream of a unified Christian world, extending from the Atlantic to the borders of Persia, died with Constantinople. The political geography of the Mediterranean was permanently altered. The cultural and intellectual center of gravity in the Christian world shifted definitively westward. The revival of classical learning, the age of exploration, the military revolution, the rise of the modern European state system, all were influenced by the shockwaves emanating from the breached walls of Constantinople. What died that day was not merely a city or an empire, but an idea, the idea of Roman continuity, of an empire that traced its legitimacy back to Augustus Caesar, that had survived for nearly 1,500 years through transformation, adaptation, and sheer endurance. The Byzantine Empire had preserved Roman law, which would become the foundation of legal systems across Europe. It had maintained diplomatic sophistication and bureaucratic efficiency that medieval Western states could not match. It had stood as the guardian of classical culture and Orthodox Christianity through centuries when Western Europe was fragmented and struggling. All of that ended when the janissaries broke through the Theodosian Walls, but what was born that day was equally significant. The recognition that a new age had dawned, one in which gunpowder weapons would decide battles, in which the old certainties of medieval Christendom no longer held, in which Europe would need to adapt or perish. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Age of Exploration, these movements that define the early modern period, were all connected, directly or indirectly, to the realization that the world had fundamentally changed when Constantinople fell. The ruins of the Theodosian Walls still stand today in Istanbul, testament to both their builders' engineering genius and to the inexorable force of historical change. Tourists walk along sections that resisted 23 sieges before finally yielding to the 24th. The Hagia Sophia, converted to a mosque in 1453, then to a museum in the 20th century, and recently to a mosque again, remains one of the architectural wonders of the world, its vast dome still inspiring awe as it has for nearly 15 centuries. These physical remnants connect our present to that pivotal moment when medieval gave way to modern, when one world ended and another began,